Okay, mic check. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3.
Zoo, here we go again. Everybody, everybody, got a lot to say, got a lot to say. Everybody, got a lot to say, got a lot to say.
My microphone is on.
Hey, welcome to the Adult Conversations podcast. And if you're watching on YouTube, thanks for tuning in to the Adult Conversations channel, where we discuss topics of adult content. Of course, this is your girl, Ijanae. You can follow me on IG at Ijanae Pollard. That's ISHANAEPOLLARD, where I will be posting the latest information on segments, upcoming books, and also upcoming events. Today, I have a very special guest, Miss Andrea Burton. And I became familiar with her when I attended a domestic violence training that she facilitated for my job. As you guys know, I work in the field of social work, so this was definitely a good training. Miss Burton was among 26 Ohio attorneys who graduated from the Ohio State Bar Association's 2020 Leadership Academy. She is a staff attorney at Youngstown Community Legal Aid, working on the legal assistance to victims team. She represents domestic violence victims in divorce and custody cases. She also is a member of the statewide task force, Ohio Legal Services Family Law Committee, where she works with other attorneys specializing in legal assistance to victims to help educate state legislators in crafting laws to better serve victims of violence. So I'm very glad that she is here. Thank you so much for being a part of this podcast. Is there anything else that you want to talk about in regards to what you do and also the population that you serve?
Sure. So I'm also a member of the policy advocacy team for two statewide organizations. One is the Women of Color Caucus,
okay,
which is part of the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence program.
Nice.
And the Anti-Oppression Committee, which is administered through the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. And so both of my positions on there are policy advocacy driven. So we provide policy statements regarding new legislation. We may even propose new legislation, but the focus, of course, is for people who are marginalized. Of course, with the Anti-Oppression Committee, that would be people of color generally, transgender women, transgender men, anyone who is sort of marginalized within the societal standards in itself, especially the justice system. And the same would apply for the Women of Color Caucus, which is typically a membership of women who are of color, but that work in service areas like you do. So social work, domestic violence advocacy, sexual assault advocacy. And so I work with those organizations and hopefully setting better policy agendas that service and don't negatively impact marginalized communities.
Right. Nice. Well, again, thank you for being a part of this podcast segment. I wanted to do a segment on domestic violence due to certain situations that have been, I want to say, put out there in our community and also amongst our youth, I should say. Of course, I'm from the millennial generation, and we see this. We're involved in some sort of aspect in social work when we work with different clientele populations and things like that. And my biggest concern was with this one situation that I came across was with the rapper Megan Thee Stallion, where she was, talking about how she got shot in both of her feet by, I guess, someone who was her lover, I don't know, friend, whomever. And there were a lot of people who were mocking it, making fun of this situation, which was not a funny situation to her. So I wanted to do something that would basically, get information out on how this is a serious matter. There are women who are actually dying at the hands of their partners, and some of them don't know how to get out of situations like this and also don't know what to do because there's just so many factors that play along into the relationship, and not just only women, men as well. So I know here in Ohio, there was a situation where in Shaker, Ohio, a teacher had died at the hands of her husband. And I believe there was a bill that was just passed this May. Is Aisha's Law, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I know that you had did an interview with WKBN TV in regards to this. Can you explain a little bit more about Aisha's Law and how that came into being? Because I'm pretty sure some people don't know what actually happened. So, yeah.
Yes, so this is a very tragic story in which a young woman, Aisha, was married to her abuser. Her abuser was actually a judge for the city of Cleveland, and she had sustained a ton of domestic violence within their relationship, but had not reported it, which is not atypical of a lot of relationships, especially within minority communities. The thought is that it stays within the family, and that's something you openly discuss, especially within the systems of criminal justice, because the tendency towards criminal justice systems to target and overly enforce laws upon Black bodies. And that's a problem that we're seeing today replicated in, the movement with George Floyd. And so this woman, very well educated, of course, her husband, extremely educated and well lauded, he was a judge, they had instances of domestic violence, but on this particular night, it was particularly violent. And it did not escape the notice from passerbyers. Essentially, the judge was beating his wife in the car while he was driving, and their 2 young children were in the back seat. He was slamming her head into the dashboard. And so she attempted to get out of the vehicle to avoid being hit, and he pulled off and took the kids. And so she felt she had no other recourse but to call the police because she wanted to protect her children, and she didn't know how he would behave. We would later come to find out that her husband had lost his mother recently, and so this was a traumatic experience that was influencing his behavior. Not that that is a justification or excuse, but we do know that trauma will certainly set off violent incidences. And the police responded and were able to go to locate him with the children, and Aisha received some services at a hospital because she had been, as I said, forcefully put into the dashboard at least 3 to 4 times. So her injuries were not minor. He also bit her, if I'm not mistaken. And as a result of that, the judge was charged with domestic violence, felonious assault, endangering children. And he ended up entering a plea to some of those charges, but not all of them. And he received I believe, a suspended sentence. There may have been just a little bit of jail time attached to it, not a significant amount for the type of abuse that was sustained. As a result of that, the Supreme Court, when attorneys or judges get in that type of trouble, have to assess whether they're going to suspend them or they're going to reprimand them, which is basically to say, you can't do this again. We're going to put monitoring conditions on you, but we'll still allow you to practice law. Aisha, being who she was, wanted to make sure that her husband could continue working even if he couldn't be a judge, because again, one of the factors that encourages domestic violence is the loss of employment. And so if you can imagine from someone who's obtained all that this couple has obtained, to have it taken away, to feel the shame of that, to feel the societal implications of being a Black man with a conviction for domestic violence, she was worried that he would go even crazier if he had been disbarred. So she actively participated in making sure that the Supreme Court just suspended him with conditions for him to be reinstated. And that include alcohol treatment and psychological treatment. Eventually, the parties were getting a divorce. There was a visitation schedule laid out for their children, one of which is special needs. And the visitation was to be supervised by the judge's sister. When Aisha came to the house for that supervised visitation, her soon-to-be ex-husband was waiting for her, hiding in the bushes, and confronted her, backed her into the house, and stabbed her multiple times, and then attempted to flee, striking a police officer cruiser in an attempt to avoid being arrested or detained or. So this was an issue where the policy implications were, how do we protect victims of violence from this extreme behavior? And in some degree, there were already protections in place for what Aisha Law did. Aisha had a protection order, which is a little known fact. She did, but it's still a piece of paper, right? So it's only as effective as the tools that can implement them and keep you safe. And so in this way, the judge attempted to avoid detection. He violated a protection order. He violated a parenting time order because he was, I believe, very mentally unwell. And while treatment may help you, there are some times where the type of treatment you need is not outpatient treatment. It's not just having meetings monthly with a therapist. It may need an actual level of inpatient treatment to sort of rid the person of the issues that they're having. And maybe it doesn't at all. Maybe it's medication and therapy intensively.
Exactly.
But Aisha's law allowed for 24 access to magistrates in order to acquire protection orders. It allowed for provisions related to domestic violence advocates to advocate for their clients. And so in some ways, it is a novel approach to domestic violence, but I will say that it is a little behind the curve. Ohio is continuously usually one of the last states in enacting and effectuating really good policies that just make sense and are common sense. And I think that that's a throwback to our traditional political values within our House, within our Senate. And so we're seeing some slow progress to where other states are. Georgia has great domestic violence laws. Florida surprisingly does too. But it's always a battle to get us where we need to be. And Aisha's law is really an honor to her for the loss that she sustained, but the type of violence that she experienced is something that most minorities and people generally, whether minorities or not, can attest to having experienced, but usually not to the point that it becomes fatal.
Exactly. Thank you for sharing that information. So I have a question in regards to that. Is there anything in the bill or any legislations or laws that we have in Ohio that is directed towards how police handle situations like this? And I'm asking from experience and also from other stories I've heard where victims actually seek help from police and may have ended up getting arrested themselves, may have not gotten the safety and protection that they were looking for, and were still able, or re-victimized, I should say, and able to be re-victimized by their perpetrator. So is there anything that is in our laws or legislations that is geared towards police and how they're handled these situations, how they learn about these situations or anything like that?
It's a very good question. And so what I can tell you is that there are provisions within the domestic violence law for the revised code, as well as the dating violence laws and the administrative code that say that when officers respond to intimate violence situations, which is what we're really talking about when we're describing domestic violence, that they are required to give victims certain information. A lot of that is tailored towards Marcy's law, which was recently passed as well. It's still heavily being modified because it's pretty intensive, the amount of policy that was attached to it, and it changed a great deal of existing laws and rules of evidence and rules of procedure that we previously understood and knew. And so Marcy's law, for those who don't know, is basically a victim's right policy statute, and it provides exactly what your rights are as a victim, which is to have notice that services can be provided for you, that protection orders may be a way to procure safety, that there are domestic violence shelters that you can go into if you're in immediate danger, and it gives the court system a guide to how to treat victims once charges are filed on their perpetrators. So you have a right to be present at all hearings, to have an advocate with you or to speak on your behalf. If you're mentally disabled or physically disabled, to have assistance with making sure your access to justice is perfected. It's a pretty pervasive law in that it set out provisions which didn't exist previously, but that we generally understood should exist, but they made them constitutional rights. So not just statutory creations or courts permitting things, it's a constitutional right, which means that it's enforceable. And we believe that you could actually sue if they're violated. It gave victims an ability to talk to the prosecutor whether they want to amend charges or to dismiss them, and to give the victim a lot more say in how the case proceeds. But of course, it didn't take away discretion from a prosecutor in terms of how a charge may continue or not continue once it's been filed. And so in answer to your question, there are laws in place that exist, but of course, that is only as good as the training that you have for the officers, right?
Right.
And so what we're seeing, and I'm going to make an analogy or simile here, is the same thing with police brutality, right? So we have guidelines of what is appropriate and reasonable behavior, but we also have cultural ideas and perceptions within our organizations, like police departments, about how you treat people who are suspected of crimes or people you suspect or don't suspect of being victims. And that color and shades our interactions with people and the services that we provide. Mm-hmm. And so the end result may be that the police department isn't intentionally violating someone's rights, but that is exactly what the effect is. They will tell you, well, if I arrest him, I have to arrest you because he's claiming that you attacked him, even though a lot of the evidence is suggesting that that didn't happen, right, and that we know abusers are manipulators. So they're able to gaslight people to believe that the situation is not what it appears. And so it's an interesting concept of course, I understand that police are in that position of having to do he said, she said, but given the totality of a circumstance, it is you're probably capable of at least referring the case to a detective to do a further investigation, but that's not even happening. And so we want to encourage victims to report offenses because we believe that the justice system should protect them, but really the justice system is doing exactly what it's designed to do, right? It's to create inequitable balances of power based upon our societal perceptions of who is more powerful. So it's of course complicated by intersections of gender and race, but typically we value men over women, right? Black, white, or indifferent. We tend to trust white males over any other category. We tend to emphasize white women. So when police officers are coming to a scene, they've internalized all of that, even if it's not deliberate, and that affects their judgment. And so they are also unwilling to maybe present a charge to a prosecutor because they think that they know what the prosecutor is going to do, because historically this is what the prosecutor has done. And so in that way, we also have departments affecting other departments' behavior. And so when we talk about justice reform, we're not just talking about police, we're talking about putting people in prosecutorial positions which are prone to actually uphold the laws and protect people who are marginalized within the community and making tough decisions. But a lot of this also goes to training, and I have to harken back to that because police departments have high turnover rates, right? So if I present a training every 2 years, but you get hired on the off year, you have a whole year before you're going to receive a specific training. Exactly. And so we don't necessarily know that you have the tools to effectively deal with these issues, but you're given a gun, you're given great discretion of who you're going to arrest and what charges are going to be filed. And that places people in a position that makes them uncomfortable with involving the criminal justice system because maybe they're used to not getting anyone to hear them. And so in some ways, what legal aid does and what legal assistance to victims does is to create a civil outlet where the criminal outlet may not exist. And so you're going to get a protection order. You're going to file contempt if it's violated continuously. You're going to get a domestic violence advocate because you may want to do treatment for the post-traumatic stress that you have or whatever circumstances led you to be in this relationship, which has affected greatly your psychological well-being. And that isn't necessarily meant to be condescending, but we know that when people experience violence, when they experience trauma, their brain starts to rewire. And so you are more than likely to get in another relationship, which is unsafe. You're more than likely to find yourself in unsafe situations because your brain is not thinking properly, and you need medical help to sort of rewire it to think healthy about yourself in the situation you find yourself in.
Exactly. So what advice would you give to, I'm going to say a woman or a man, who's in a situation where they're being attacked and they call out for help, they call police, and they show up to the scene. Police don't necessarily do the work to figure out what has happened, who's the victim, who's the perpetrator or the aggressor, and both are taken in. what would you suggest that the victim in that situation do?
This is a very good question. And I was a criminal defense attorney for about 6 years before I switched to being a domestic violence attorney. And so it's twofold. If you have charges filed against you which may not be truthful, and of course the justice system has a preference to pleading people out, putting them on probation, and telling you, well, you didn't go to jail, you're not going to go to jail, so this is no big deal. But really the effect is that the collateral consequences of entering a plea of guilty and being on probation are so pervasive that you can't begin to fathom them when you agree to it. You just want to get out of the situation that you're in.
Right.
So the prospect is that you, of course, then are in a criminal justice system where you may have a court-appointed attorney because you can't afford your own attorney. And you're hoping that your court-appointed attorney is listening to you, is not encouraging you to plead without considering any of the things that you have to say or any evidence that you can use to prove that you were defending yourself, or that this was an example of your abuser gaslighting everyone to make them think that you were also an aggressor in the situation or the sole aggressor in the situation. And so the answer is complicated, right? Because we don't tell people or encourage people to plead to anything you didn't do, but at the same time, your life is such that you can't go to jail or you're going to lose where you're staying. You're going to lose your job. There's no one to take care of your kids. And those are all scary factors. But I think that there is no easy answer for me to tell you. But pleading to something that you didn't do is probably not in your best interest, at least not all the time. And so fighting and talking to, insisting that the court and the prosecutor talk to people who you've been speaking with about the abuse in your relationship, keeping text messages and Facebook posts and Facebook Messenger posts and pictures of the things that have happened in the past tend to set a tone for what has occurred throughout your relationship. And it gives you more credibility than the abuser when testifying as to what happened on that day. And it can certainly be useful in helping you get those charges dismissed because they're not rightfully placed against you. And on the same side of that is that you have a right civilly to take actions to protect yourself, even if the criminal justice cases are pending. Now, sometimes it doesn't make sense to do them at the same time, but sometimes it does. If you are a victim and you have not been charged, but you are the victim in a criminal case, well, you more than likely have a no contact or a criminal no contact order in place already. So maybe undertaking a civil trial for a protection order isn't in your best interest until right before that criminal no contact order is going to lapse. And because if the person is convicted, then that's basically a slam dunk in the civil case because the burden of proof is much higher in the criminal case. But I think that a lot of it is covering your butt, which means that even if you don't want to put people in your business, there are a number of websites and sources out there which will store information protected from your abuser so that they can't delete it. There's a PIN, there's a passcode, and it will store text messages and pictures and any narrative statements that you want to provide about things that have happened in case something happens to you. And that sounds kind of morbid, right? That you are preparing for the worst case scenario, whether you're killed or whether you're wrongfully charged for defending yourself or from the gaslighting by the abuser. Right. But you're already in a worst case scenario, aren't you? If the person that you love most is abusing you, then it's time that you make at least some precautions to protect yourself from further abuse, whether it's by the system or your abuser by pretending to be the victim. And so that's the best way to accomplish that. Even just creating a separate email account that you never use or open, but you forward all of those emails to that account. And so that if something happens, you have access to it. Maybe it's telling your best friend what's going on or your mom. And then that way, these people can testify to having seen bruises on you or having received pictures or phone calls in the middle of the night in which you were frantic and that you sounded like you were petrified of what was occurring in your household. And that is all helpful.
Exactly. And I asked that question because I myself personally was in a situation just like that, where my former, I'm not going to say spouse, but my former paramour was attacking me, and I reached out to the police, and coming on the scene, it was just like, well, we don't know, so we're going to take you both in. I'm like, wait a minute. Like, why would I call on myself if I knew that I was the aggressor? If I was attacking him, I wouldn't have called on myself, so I wouldn't have got in trouble. I'm calling you guys for help, and I'm being taken in. How is this even possible? So, and I know with that situation, it was just so draining that I ended up pleading. I'm like, you know what? I'm not about to go through this. I'm going to plead down. It just is what it is at this particular point. And so moving forward, when I hear other women or men in that situation, I tell them like, no, stick it out, because if I could go back and do that over again, I would have fought that to the root. Like, I would not have gone through that entire process. I would have fought it. And I know a lot of people feel like they can't trust the police, and they keep staying in these situations. And I try to encourage, like, no, even if it gets to the point where you are arrested again, make the paper trail, because if it's documented that you called for the help, and if you get arrested as well, keep that paper trail and fight that through. So I'm glad that you mentioned what you did in regards to that, because it's a very unnerving and also draining situation. And sometimes people just do not know what to do in those situations. I know I didn't. So also I had came across some different questions or common questions relating to intimate partner violence and also domestic violence that I wanted to ask you to get your input on.
Sure.
So the first question, which I thought was a good question to ask, was, do some women or men, because I want to put men into this too, provoke violence by nagging?
So that is a very good question. And I wanted to say that I'm very sorry that happened to you. And it's actually not an uncommon situation, but it's so hard because on the one end, you are dealing with a person who's a victim of violence, and then you're just dealing with a very bad criminal justice response to it. Right. And I think to some degree, you also have the stigma that no one believes you, right? So right. You have this conviction, and if you try to explain, people, they're really like, yeah, sure, you were the person who was attacked. And that's because in their life, they've never had this experience, so therefore no one else can have this experience, which is basically the definition of how we continue to have structural racism and prejudices within our systems, because some people don't experience it, so they don't think it doesn't exist.
Exactly.
So can you provoke it? So I'm a millennial too, and so I have been following Megan Thee Stallion's journey, and it's sort of heart-wrenching because there's a weapon involved, which is pretty severe. Right. And then I also always go back to the Chris Brown, Rihanna situation, and I just think, oh my God, when I saw those pictures and then the comments people were making about how she must have said something to deserve it. And there is absolutely nothing you can say which would justify someone physically being violent with you, with the exception of saying, I'm going to affirmatively hurt you or kill you, and then to make efforts with a weapon in your hand to do that. But to just nag someone, meaning, maybe you're not great at communication. Maybe you do beat someone down with your words to the point that you anger them. Mm-hmm. That does not justify physically attacking someone. What that justifies is you walking away until the situation can cool down, or you leave the person because they can't communicate or talk to you properly, right? So adults use words, and we hope that our children use words instead of violence. And so with words, you have infinite amounts of power to express why something is not working. And beating someone is probably not the safest way to make something work, right? So I hate to say that sometimes you have to leave a person that you love, that you think you love most, and that you'll never find someone else again. But if the person is disrespecting you, how much love do they have for you?
Exactly.
Really? You can go to therapy to talk about how to better effectively communicate and how the person can stop nagging. And you will be the bigger and better person than to personally attack the person with your violence because of the situation or the thing that they said. And so, no, I do not believe there are circumstances and again, there are extremes for everything, so I'm going to qualify this as a generalization that would justify you physically being violent with someone because they are nagging or condescending towards you.
Exactly. And then I'm glad that you referenced the Chris Brown and Rihanna situation. And I know when that occurred, I think I had to be about 17 or 18 when that happened. I don't know, but in my ignorance, that was something that I said. She provoked him. She must have did something. And then growing up and working in this field, I'm like, oh no, I was so wrong into thinking that, because like you said, nothing that anyone says should get you to a point where you want to put your hands on them. That's just not right. It's just not, it's a total no. So, and I know a lot of people say that she provoked them. Well, what did she do? No, it's not a what did she do. Do not put your hands on someone. And it goes for women too. Do not put your hands on that man. So it's just, I think a lot of education needs to be had in regards to situations like this, because a lot of people are just not educated on the topic at hand, period. So I'm glad that you definitely brought that up, because I know that once people hear this, they're going to go back to the Rihanna and Chris Brown situation and be like, oh, shoot, it's serious out here. So another question was, is domestic violence a learned behavior? Or intimate partner violence, is that a learned behavior?
I believe that it can be. I think we develop our sense of right and wrong from the situations that we're born into or the things that we learn over our lifetime. And so typically there is a statistical probability that if you have witnessed domestic violence because of parents or siblings, you're more than likely to find yourself in similar situations, whether you're the abuser or the abusee. And really, when we talk to men who were abusers, one of the common things that they do say is that this is all that I've ever known. This is how I thought they were supposed to react and to treat people that you cared about. And so it isn't that I am trying to be particularly violent or uncaring. I thought that this was a way of expressing that I cared, because only she or he could make me this mad that I would respond the way that I did. And so if it's a learned behavior, that means it can be unlearned, right? There's no reason why you can't change a pattern of conduct to when you know that it's unsafe. And I think that there is the added layer of stigma within the African American community where we don't really talk about these issues. We try to keep it to ourselves. And that is probably not the best or safe way, because there is violence going on in the top echelons of society, right? There are people who have billions of dollars of money and they're getting beat or they are beating people. Domestic violence is not something that only happens to Black or brown people. It happens to everyone, and the stigma attached to it is what makes people not talk about it. But it has to be sort of freeing to say that I survived something, I wasn't to blame for it, and I'm here because I want to make sure that it doesn't happen to anyone else. And one of the things that I say to my clients, because more commonly than not, these incidents happen to people who have children together, is how would you want your son or daughter to be treated this way? Do you tell your daughter that it's okay for her boyfriend to slap her across the face? Do you tell her that it's okay to be disrespected and have her body shamed? To call her a liar, to be stalked, to be threatened, to be ordered to not see her family? You don't do that. You would never do that. So why then are you accepting that this is what your life has to be like? There is something that's telling you that you deserve it, or that this is the type of behavior that people we love sometimes inflict upon us, but you know reasonably that that's not the case. So yes, I think that we all have moments where we align with the wrong person, like you were describing the Chris Brown and Rihanna thing, but your thinking has evolved. And I think that that's fine. That's growth. That's human. And you can always reassess a belief that you have and what it's supported by and based upon, and to challenge it to grow healthier conversations and thoughts later at another time. And that's not a failing to stick on the wrong side. That is something that all of us need to do, and it takes a lot of humanity to do it.
Yes, exactly. So the next question is, he hasn't actually hit me. Does that mean it's not domestic violence?
This is a very good question. I dealt with this issue yesterday. So Ohio, again, is behind the times in terms of describing what domestic violence behavior is, but let's define it. So typically, the known definition of domestic violence is the attempt or the actual causing of physical harm. So the attempt, of course, is I go to hit or punch you and I miss, but my intention was to strike you, right? So that's still domestic violence. The threat of domestic violence, I'm going to hit you. If you ever leave me, I will kill you. I will kill the person you're with. That is domestic violence. It's also aggravated menacing. There's something within the domestic violence statute that I do use, which is called recklessness. And so let's give a situation where that might occur. We're arguing in the kitchen, and I pick up a jar of cookies, and I throw them at you, and it's near your head. And the glass shatters. Maybe some of the glass cuts you, whether on your face, on your hands, on your arms. That is recklessness, because I disregarded a known fact that the act that I'm taking, throwing this jar, may have a detrimental effect on you. And I still do it. That's domestic violence. Aggravated trespass, which means the intention of trespassing on property with the goal to commit a felony, is domestic violence. Stalking behavior where you are an intimate partner, where you've lived together in the last 5 years, or married, or have a child together, is still domestic violence, even though we call it stalking. So stalking under Ohio law is pretty vague, actually. It's a general category, which means that if you present it right, you can show a lot of things as stalking, even though they're not typically the things that we would understand as stalking. Like, I'm following you around, I show up at your job, I show up at your work, I show up at your house, I show up at your friend's house, I call you 50 times, I text you, I send you a FaceTime request. That's typical stalking behavior. But the way the law is written, it says that there are 2 or more occurrences. That establishes a pattern of behavior with the intent of those occurrences of causing you severe emotional distress. Now, 10 years ago, severe emotional distress meant that it was a hard burden to prove. It meant that you were under the treatment of a psychologist, that you took medication. That's no longer what we believe to be true. We mean that the severe emotional stress can be changes in patterns that you commonly see with abuse victims or people who have suffered trauma. So like PTSD symptoms. I have a hard time sleeping. I no longer enjoy the activities that I once enjoyed. I only sleep. I check my surroundings constantly because I don't know if this person is following me. I don't go over my friend's house anymore. I've changed my number. I've avoided, I've moved. All of this is something that shows a change in your normal routine, which would suggest that the trauma is affecting you in some way. And so that can fall under stalking behavior. And so the woman I was speaking to yesterday was married to her abuser for a very long time. And she was describing emotional behavior where he would totally disrespect her, denigrate her, get within an inch of her face yelling, but he had never hit her in 30 years of marriage, had never done it. And so that was more of a stalking case because it was a pattern of behavior, right? And a pattern means 2 or more occurrences. So really you can have a pattern in one day. If I yell at you in the morning and to yell at you in the evening, that's 2 or more occurrences. Now replicate that over 30 years, right? Yeah. And then how is that influencing her? She's stressed. She started taking Xanax to lower her level. She doesn't go out because she would be bombarded with phone calls about where she is and that she's cheating. And she doesn't even want to come out of her room because if she's in the kitchen, he's going to yell at her about being a terrible person. And so that is probably emotional distress that arises to the level of stalking, but because they're married, it's domestic violence. So yes, it does not have to be that I've actually ever hit you, but I've set you on a pattern of behavior to believe or perceive that you're receiving emotional distress, and that emotional distress has caused you to change some way psychologically. And as long as you can testify as an example, or you have other people who can say, she's lethargic, she won't go out with us anymore, she barely responds to text messages, she doesn't dress the same, she used to, dress maybe a little more revealing, And now she covers up from head to toe. And I attribute this to him basically shaming her and calling her a whore. And all of that can certainly help you, even if you've never exactly been hit by someone. And it still has an effect on you, right? Those types of constant diminishings, they affect a person.
Exactly. The next question is, does alcohol or drugs cause domestic violence?
It's a very good question. I've been thinking about this week, actually.
Okay.
So LAV, we are grant funded, which means we receive funding from the state and federal government in order to pay attorneys to represent people. And so they ask us these questions sometimes where they say, can you pinpoint a case where substance abuse is a factor? And this past Friday, so exactly 7 days ago, we met with a woman who provides a men's abuse, basically a counseling session that is over multiple months and weeks that helps to reverse this behavior towards abusing women. So the abusers meet is usually part of a criminal program or conviction. And I will say that substance abuse can certainly make it easier for you to justify your behavior, right? You may not recall or how intense that you became, but in general, I think that the tools to abuse were there before.
Okay.
And so the likelihood that the abuse is being caused by alcohol or other substances is probably not the case, but it is a factor which makes you out of control that we should try to address, because if we remove those barriers to rational or logical thought, which, is essentially why we consume alcohol, it's why we enjoy getting drunk, because we lower our prohibitions and it feels good.
Exactly.
I think that then it will reduce the risk of engaging in abusive behavior. But there are also people who have mental health issues, right? And so they self-medicate by drinking alcohol or abusing drugs, whether it's marijuana, which I understand that people, especially in the African-American community, like to use, even though they don't have a medicinal purpose for it. But marijuana is still an altering drug, especially when taken with other things.
Exactly.
And so it's never as simple as I'm stressed out, I'm going to smoke, and you're stressing me out. So in order to not do this, I'm going to smoke. These are choices that we're making. And maybe what we really need is to engage in mental health treatment. And again, minorities are very reluctant to do that.
Exactly.
But frankly, every person in their lifetime will suffer some type of mental disorder that requires them to get treatment. And by that, I can just mean common variety depression. And so you need to use the tools that are at your disposal, that reasonably can be at your disposal, to better yourself and to not make excuses for why you are engaging in behavior which is detrimental to you. So I'm not saying that use of marijuana for recreational purposes is bad. It's illegal. So I'm not giving you that stigma. But what I'm saying is, but are you using it as an excuse to not do other things that you should be doing? Right. Or to engage in behavior that you shouldn't be engaging in? So yes, substance abuse can affect or influence how domestic violence occurs. And I do believe that it can be especially used by people with mental health disorders to self-medicate. But overall, do I think it is the reason that people are beating their partners? No, I don't think that that's the case.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that information. Is domestic violence more prevalent in some cultures? Or I think you answered that already.
Yeah, so it's a complicated question. There are even religious sects that encourage husbands to beat their wives in order to gain compliance, and that's in the Christian faith. I know that there are, again, religious sects which encourage the subjugation of men and women, which I think anytime that you do that, that can lead to domestic violence, because it's the feel that you're superior or someone else is inferior to you. And in relationships, ideally, you would be equal partners. You're co-equal partners. It's not perfectly equal in every way, but overall, there's a 50-50 balance. And so I will not say that I necessarily believe that particular cultures are more violent than others. I know that I've heard stigmas that Hispanic men are just so passionate that that's why Hispanic men and women commit domestic violence, or that these stigmas that Black women are hypersexualized, right? And so that fosters the belief that even young children who are girls but are Black they entice people to abuse them because they're more sexualized than other people. That doesn't make sense. It's a child, right?
Exactly.
The abuser sexualizes the person, but it is not the victims who are putting themselves in this victim situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to stop doing that, because the stigma then allows us to view this person as less than a human, which
Right.
then allows us to justify being bigoted or ignorant or racist towards them. And I can't encourage that. Now, I have seen situations, because we deal with immigrant populations, where
Right.
maybe it's more common, but is it really because that they're from a different culture, meaning a different country? Or is it that an immigrant is more vulnerable than any other population? You're away from the country you were originally from. You maybe not even speak the language very well that you're here. You don't have a job. You're at home every day, and your abuser has control over the money.
Mm-hmm.
So is it really just that the dynamics are different because the ability to control is higher in those situations, and not because it's cultural? That's something to think about. So it's complicated in terms of, again, intersectionality of all that a person represents. We're not just one thing.
Mm-hmm.
You and I are Black, but we're also women. And so that shades how society sees us, how it treats us, and how we see one another.
Exactly.
So I won't say that culturally it can happen, but I think that anytime that there are great imbalances of power, you're going to see people who treat other people very poorly, because it's easy to do.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Woo! She dropping jewels for y'all today, y'all. So, is there, I don't want to say is there, where could people who are experiencing intimate partner violence, domestic violence within their homes, where can they reach out, get services, get help, and also, what other things can they do to remove themselves from situations like this? And I know that certain situations, it's not easily able to remove yourself, that you're not able to easily remove yourself. So what can they do to get the help or access the help if they are basically at a standstill and don't know what to do?
So there are any number of websites that exist out there, and the websites are getting better at having quick exits. So it'll say at the top of a website, whether it's on your phone or on a tablet or a computer, leave this website immediately. And then it'll take you to something innocuous like the Wikipedia page. And there you can find tons of information and resources. One of them is the Ohio Domestic Violence Network website.
Okay.
Of course, we have a website, which is communitylegalaid.org. There are any number of national websites that deal with domestic violence that have that similar feature, but where you can find information. You can always contact a domestic violence shelter and, of course, delete your call log so the person doesn't know where you called. And you can speak to an advocate about what your resources are. It doesn't mean that you have to go into a shelter to receive services. And so that's a common misperception, but I am always directing people to a domestic violence shelter, not because they're homeless or transitory in living, but because the resources there are for people who do and do not live there. So you can meet with an advocate and get a safety plan in position. So if you have to make a quick exit, they are telling you to have certain documents put into a bag, and you know where that bag is so that you're ready to go, that you have a person you can call. I had a client who developed such an elaborate plan that it sounded like a Lifetime movie. She had notified friends of hers of the violence that she was experiencing. And luckily, this man who was helping her was a very kind person, him and his wife. And so they had developed that if she or her kids texted puppy at any point in the day, that they would immediately call the police and go to the house to remove them, and that they would come live with them. And that's what happened at one point. And she stayed with this family, and they got her a job. They helped her move across the country, but there are resources out there that can actually help you relocate. It's called Relocation Program, and that's administered through the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, and you can apply through a domestic violence shelter to do that. And again, you don't have to live in a domestic violence shelter to use it. There are funds that can be utilized by the Attorney General's office. Every victim within the state of Ohio has about $50,000 that is dedicated for services if you can provide that the services are tailored to sexual assault or domestic violence. And so maybe it's getting cameras installed at your house or getting locks changed. Maybe it is helping you relocate even within the county, or to give you a bus ticket to go across the country. It could be for victim services like therapy for missing work. You can get a wage replacement. It can also be utilized to pay deductibles because of insurance when you have to go to the hospital, to get medical records if you're going to go to court. All of these services are available, and the best way to reach them is one of two ways. Again, through your local domestic violence shelter by calling that number, or by calling or going to the websites for community legal aid. And you can certainly get those resources through us, whether we have a paralegal help you acquire them, or we connect you to the domestic violence advocate so that you feel a little safer because you've talked to an attorney. You don't have to undertake legal action to speak with us. That's not our job. It's not to convince you that you have to do this or you have to do that. We believe people are self-autonomous. They're going to make the best decision that they can make for themselves and their family in the situation that they have it. We just present you with options. We may not fully understand because we've never stood exactly in your shoes, but we want you to have all the information to make an educated and informed decision. And sometimes that's dismissing a case or not proceeding because you do want to reconcile. And that happens more often than I can tell you. And it's all my intention to say that if you set out safe precautions for how you're going to remove what is causing this domestic violence, whether it's issues with communication or anger or taking medication for mental health issues, we want to help you get that plan in place so that we don't have to see you again. And we certainly don't want to read about you dying in the newspaper. So it isn't about us telling you you gotta leave and this person is never going to change, but can we just give you the resources and information for you to make that decision for yourself? And the resources are definitely out there, but you just need to know where you can at least ask the questions to find out how to begin that process. And so we're happy to do that. The Ohio Victims Compensation Fund has a website where it'll tell you exactly what you may be eligible for if you are a victim of a crime, whether it's a criminal prosecution or a civil protection order. And there are any number of websites that can tell you about how to acquire a civil protection order, or you can just call us or go to our website and we'll describe how we can effectively help you do that. And to just remember that you can always reverse course. So if you decide that you want a protection order and you get one, and then you decide, well, I don't necessarily feel in danger anymore, we can help you dismiss that if you want to. Sometimes people are married to their abusers and they file for divorce and decide, no, we're not going to get a divorce. That's okay too. But we just have a ton of resources. Obviously, they're not unlimited. You know, budget cuts are real. And under the Trump administration, there is a prioritization of other things that are not domestic violence victims, but we will try to get you the resources that we can to help better your situation if that's what you're determined to do.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that information for everyone. Also, because I should have asked this question as well, I don't want to forget the fellas out there who may be listening to this segment as well. Can you share your experience with men who report or do not report instances where they are the victim? And then also, could you give some encouragement to some men who may feel like they shouldn't or can't report in cases where they are the victim?
So this is a really great question. Men are just as likely as being victims of domestic violence, whether it's in hetero or homosexual relationships, right? And so the stigma usually is attached to the police, so that if you call the police as a man, they think, yeah, okay, she's beating you up. And maybe you're much bigger than her. And so the perception is that you could just hurt her if you really wanted to, but that's not your intention, because that's not the person who you are, and because that wouldn't be right.
Right.
So I've seen those instances play out, including with, how the perception is in the criminal justice system. And I can appreciate why you don't want to report, but you're also just as valuable as a woman. Exactly. And you don't deserve to have your humanity taken away from you by being beat like an animal or a dog. And in fact, we would never encourage people to beat animals or dogs. We tend to care about animals more than we do humans nowadays.
Right. Exactly.
And so I think that it takes a lot of courage. And so I'm not diminishing what it may be, the perception that you create by calling the police on someone who's abusing you. but you should do so because you have value and you deserve to be treated and respected well, just like your partner does. Exactly. And I also think that if you don't want to involve the police, but you want to get a protection order because the person is abusive or they're stalking you, that is not unreasonable. And I don't think that in the civil realm, we see the same type of stigma that we see in the criminal realm from men filing for protection orders against women. We represent men and women equally, but of course we receive more reports of women because of the power dynamic typically is one where the ability for physical aggression is less for a woman than it is a man, but that's not always consistently the case. There will be times when we have a really big guy who just does not know what to do because he knows if he responds, even with raising his voice, this person could call and say, he's beating me, and she will be believed. So again, this goes back to why would you continue to put yourself in a situation with someone who claims to love you? They wouldn't make you repeat this over and over again on a monthly or weekly basis. And so you can remove yourself and hope that the person can change and get services so that they can change, but you have to make that initial step, an investment in yourself. And it is an investment in yourself that you deserve more, or at least you don't deserve this. And so, yes, men can be victims of domestic violence. They often are victims of domestic violence, and they should report, whether it's to the police or whether they withdraw from the situation and seek civil services to prevent it from happening. And yes, you too should probably see a counselor about reversing the behavior which makes you believe that you deserve this, or finding other situations in which it occurs. And it's likely because it's learned behavior. And so not every man who witnesses abuse is going to become the abuser. He could become the abusee. And so we have to internalize how things in trauma affect men and women, and sometimes it's very similar. Meaning you can definitely be a victim even if you're considered the stronger sex. So the advice is gender neutral. If you are a victim of violence or stalking or sexual assault, you should make efforts to protect yourself, even if you choose not to go the criminal justice route.
Exactly. And I'm glad that you brought up the suggestion to remove yourself. I know that I say this to a lot of men that I talk about in situations like this, because I know a lot of them are like, well, I'm not just going to let a woman hit me. I'm going to hit her back. And I'm like, look, especially if you are African American and you are a male, you are going to jail. If she's hitting you, remove yourself if you could possibly do that, because when a police comes out there, they're going to look at you, they're going to look at her, and they're going to probably be like, hey, bro, you got to go. You're going with me. And don't put yourself in that situation, because we are already at that particular instance where we're in the criminal justice system. We're in the system, period. We're going to get locked up.
Right.
Waiting for us. So I understand it may bruise your pride, your ego, or whatever the case is, but no, you just got to remove yourself from the situation. And like you said, report it, because your life is valuable as well, and you don't deserve that particular type of behavior. So
right. And so it's also this stigma that we also believe that we have to be macho, right? So that Black men are macho, and I don't agree with that. I think that is you buying into the idea of what society has told you look like. Exactly. And why are you buying into the oppressor's idea of who you are?
Exactly.
Instead in your own idea of what that looks like. And so everyone is pretty prolific on their phones. It's in their hand at any time. So recording the interactions that you're having with your girlfriend, where she's smacking you upside your head and cussing you out and telling you you're nothing and I'm going to call a police, even if you don't call the police at that time on that, you have it saved, which is tend to suggest that she's done this again and before, and she has manipulated the situation, just like what I termed before, gaslighting, to make her the victim. And this machismo that you're defining, do you want to go to jail or do you want to be free? Is that machismo that important to you? Because I think my freedom is more important than someone I don't know thinking that I'm a wimp. Someone who I don't know, who likely has been in similar situations, whether they're the abuser or the abusee, and did nothing. So value what your idea of who you are is above anyone else's, because that's the only person you wake up with is yourself. Exactly. And so I understand that it's complicated, but I think that for Black people and minorities in general, playing into these ideas of who we are, these stereotypes that we're flashy, that, you know, we're great, we're culturally the thing that you want to be, is sometimes a way of keeping you powerless and making you feel powerful. And I would rather be powerful and have people perceive me as not than to have this fake sense of, you know, powerfulness, but then know that I'm basically a pawn in someone else's game.
Exactly. Woo. Yes. So I thank you for coming on this podcast segment. And can you, I don't know what's the process for people to basically reach out for your services. Can you let them know that before we end? Mm-hmm.
So, of course, we have eligibility determinations for people who are eligible for our services, but generally you have to be 200% below federal poverty guidelines, which for a family of four is roughly $52,000 a year, and for a single household is roughly $25,000. But that does not mean that you don't have such debts that you pay on a normal basis that you would not otherwise be eligible for our services, even if you make more than that. So we always take debts into considerations, the obligations of things that you have to pay, like rent or transportation to get to places. So let's say you make $20,000, but you have all these fixed obligations, that would probably bring you within our service category, especially in places like Youngstown or Akron, where we know that typically the wealth disparity income is one in which Black and brown people are probably going to be financially disadvantaged compared to other people. Mm-hmm. And just because we can't help you directly, let's say because you're not financially eligible, doesn't mean we won't refer you for services where your income doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. We don't really have income caps for people, elderly people within the population who may, you know, through Social Security or pensions have more money than the average person, but the elderly people are still just as vulnerable. And we typically see that as the cutoff age. So usually it's 60 and over. So that's still pretty young in comparison, but we will still provide services to those individuals. We do provide services related to domestic violence, of course, divorces, custody cases sparingly, but we do provide some services for them. We do consumer protection, bankruptcy, landlord tenant. We do expungement clinics, CQEs for people who have convictions that can't be expunged, but they can get certifications that approve them to work in certain fields. We do driver's license clinics. We do any number of services. So if you have a legal issue, we will be happy to make a determination of this is something that we can provide services for. And if it's not, referring you to an agency that can provide it. I will just say that we are being inundated with service requests at this point because the pandemic has put people in vulnerable situations where they can't leave. They're abusers, their children can't leave their parents. They're not going to school for 7 hours a day. They're not going to day camp. And so we are trying to prioritize the cases that are in need more than any other, but typically we have a very quick turnaround for victims of violence or sexual assault and dating violence. And so if your concern is in terms of immediacy, well, then you can contact us, but also be aware that almost every court within our service area has social workers that work at the court and can help you complete a domestic violence protection order or any number of protection orders, because there are 4 of them in the state of Ohio, immediately, as long as you come during normal business hours. And of course, if it's after normal business hours, perhaps going into a shelter just until the court systems open back up is the best way to prevent you from being discovered, because the shelters are actually, the addresses are not known, they're not public record, and you can get the services that way. And of course, even when we're not here, the shelters are open and they have people who are totally versed in how to deal with the system, and we'll make sure that you can circle back to us once we are open and able to provide services.
Okay, great. Well, again, I thank you, Ms. Burton, for being a part of this podcast segment. If you are a part of the Adult Conversations group, make sure that you comment your thoughts about this segment. If you are watching on YouTube, make sure that you hit that notification button so that you are notified for when I do other segments, and also comment your thoughts about this segment that you are listening to. Again, Ms. Burton, thank you so much, and hopefully I will be able to do further or more segments with you in regards to this topic, in regards to how we can help others in our communities and other communities as well.
Thank you.
No problem.